Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. My name is Asha, and I'll be your main speaker. My friend Dambara here is going to be playing some music for us, and we're all just going to participate, I hope, in what will be an interesting and, God willing, an informative evening. We're here to talk about specifically the subject of healing, but also I'm here just in general to share the possibilities of finding happiness in life, which is really what healing is all about. I've come to Wellington. We're in the middle of a 5-week journey. I live in California, and I've brought 4 other Americans from California, 1 from Oregon, 3 from California, 1 from Oregon, to share in this time. We're all part of a community called Ananda, which is based on the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda and his book. I'll hold it up just so you can see it, Autobiography of a Yogi, which some of you have read. I have to always say, this is the original first edition of this book. If you've read an orange version, I would encourage you also to try reading this one. I'll talk a little bit more about it as I go along. Our community is based on the principle of meditation and on the very simple idea that we are manifestations of a greater reality, and the happiness and fulfillment that everyone is seeking can be found first within. But to make that simple declaration and then to understand how to realize that in your life is really the whole project. It's easy to say where we're going, and then you have to get there. I've traveled to India many times from San Francisco, and it seems like such a simple idea until I'm in about the 15th hour of the flight from San Francisco to Dubai, and I wonder why on earth I have done this to myself again. It's a little bit the way we feel about reincarnating, isn't it? It seemed like such a good idea at the time, but then here we are. We find ourselves in the middle of perhaps more than we bargained for. So the purpose of being here is to just share with you really what these great souls have shared with me. Paramhansa Yogananda lived in America from 1920 until his death in 1952. He was born in India and was sent by great Himalayan masters, it's all in this book, to re-express ancient teachings in a way that was accessible to modern thinking people, especially Westerners. I was born in 1947. I was 5 years old when Yogananda died and did not have the destiny to meet him. But the gentleman here in the color picture, Swami Kriyananda, was his direct disciple. Kriyananda was 22 in 1948 when he read Autobiography of a Yogi, except Yogananda was still living, so he had the option to go and literally throw himself at his feet and ask to become his disciple. So the last 4 years of Yogananda's life, Kriyananda, as he is called, lived with him. And then some years later, I had the good fortune to meet Kriyananda, and thus this is the way these things work. The one who has an understanding turns and shares with everyone standing behind them. So I've spent most of the last 40 plus years all of the last 40 plus years, following a spiritual path, meditating according to the principles of Kriya Yoga. And when I was 24, I moved into a spiritual community, not a monastery, but a community, which is one of the innovations that Yogananda brought, which is that in this particular age, people are more inclined to try to embrace all ways of living and make them spiritual, rather than draw these fierce lines in the sand. I'll go off to the desert, I'll go off to the Himalayas, I won't have children, I won't get married, I won't have anything to do with anything, which is the way it's always been done until now. And yet, it's a bit difficult when you're all by yourself and people inviting you out to go to the pub at night and get drunk on Saturdays and just live for the moment without any sense of higher values. It's a little bit hard to hold the rudder clear. So making alliances with like-minded souls is a very important part of what we're all trying to do right now, to bring light into the world, bring light into our own hearts. And it's that simple spirit that has brought us all these miles from California. Plus, I mean, everyone in America thinks that New Zealand is really interesting. So we thought we should just come. There's a certain element of just pure fun in the whole trip. But the other side of it was, maybe there's kindred spirits, maybe there's friends, maybe there's something in the life that we've been living that would also be relevant for other people. And so we're just here to share in the simplest possible way, because this is the assignment that was given to me by my teacher a long time ago. And I've found, as I'm going to talk, when I start talking about healing, which is the same as being attuned to a greater reality, the more closely we live according to what we're called to do, the more harmonious every aspect of our life becomes. Standing in the room here, in the back, just so you, Rachel and Brian, why don't you wave? Okay? Dear friends, Brian grew up in the community that I live in. Also went through 8th grade in the schools that we have, and he and Rachel live in one of our communities. Dambara is going to be singing for you in a few moments. Atmajoti, who's standing in the back. She and I live in the community close to San Francisco, and I'm pointing them all out because when I stop talking, you'll want to talk to all of them too. Okay. When I was 18, I went to college, university. I did forget to introduce our New Zealand host, Kavita, in the orange sweater, Brian, in the back there. Okay. I'm just thinking of the Americans, very self-centered of me. When I was 18, I started at university. I went to Stanford University, which is a reasonably prestigious school, perhaps less exclusive when I went there, which was quite a long time ago. And they had a policy, which seemed like a good idea, which is that all the freshmen came a week early. And we all went into our dorms, and we were supposedly to get oriented before all the other students descended. But what happened was you had almost exclusively on the campus, however many hundreds we were, of 18-year-olds, most of us away from home for the first time. Boarding school is not an American custom, and it extremely intense about the whole thing. And I observed in that the whole place kind of went into what I called social gridlock. It's like everyone was afraid to be the first one to make a move. Nobody knew what was expected, and very few of us had any friends. And I just watched us, the whole thing like this, like the Los Angeles freeways. Nobody could go anywhere. And I was just as insecure as everyone else. I have a certain inner reality that has always been with me, but I wasn't very confident in it at that time. But I just looked at this, and I thought it was just a desperate situation that somebody had to move. So I just made this decision that I would pretend that I was perfectly confident, and that I alone among those hundreds of freshmen was not afraid of being rejected and doing something really awful. And I just kind of moved out into the world that I was living in as if it was going to welcome me. And very interestingly, on that very day, I ended up with one really close friend, practically the only friend I still have from those days, and I met her almost immediately as soon as I made that shift. And as soon as I made that shift, I began to see that everything around me was then also able to move. And what was so fascinating to me about the whole experience, of course, is that I really didn't feel any better than anyone else felt, but I saw very powerfully, in a way that I have never forgotten, that the most paralyzing quality in human life is fear, especially fear for yourself, just self-concern, what's going to become of me. In our Ananda community, Swami Kriyananda would often use humor to help us to understand things, and he would very often make fun of attitudes that one might otherwise be inclined to have seriously. so that him having joked about it in calm circumstances would make it harder for you to actually be like that later. And there's a book, Charlotte's Web, I presume it's popular here. And there's this, I guess it's the spider or someone in that book is always asking Charlotte, "What's in it for me, Charlotte?" Like that. And so often in our lives, Swamiji would just, well, what about me? What about me? What about me? And of course, he was the most selfless person I'd ever met, so it was a ludicrous statement. Even, in fact, we have this ritual that we do every week. It's called the Festival of Light. It's a beautiful ceremony that's part of our devotional service that we do on Sunday mornings. And there's a line in it, there's an allegory about a bird, and the bird gets very confused about his destiny. And he says, "What else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself?" Now, of course, it's a rhetorical question, and the answer to it is that that's a stupid thing to be doing. But in fact, I often quote that when I want things for myself. I quote the Festival of Light. It says, "What else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself?" Even though it's exactly the opposite. I watched this little tiny child once. We project upon little children all this sweetness just because they're so cute. The child's sitting there and she starts singing one of these beautiful chants, Sri Ram, Jai Ram, Krishna, 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 or something like that. And, oh, it's so dear. And then exactly to the same melody, she sees her bottle and her stuffy, and she starts singing, "Mine, mine, 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 mine," and just pulls them into her, just revealing much more about her true nature. Most of us move through this world with a constant, what I can only call just a slight state of tension. Isn't it so? We're always just a little bit concerned about what's going to happen to me. What do people think? How are they going to respond? Am I going to be an old lady on the street with no place to go? Will people really love me? When I first got married, I've been married 30-some years now, to a very wonderful man who keeps the home fires burning. He's not traveling with me. His name is David. When I very first was married to him, I had been single for a decade, quite happily single. It was a very specific karma. It was not an inclination to get married. It was him, and there he was, and that was the end of my single life. I freely and honestly admit it. But I was very anxious not to fall into the kind of emotional vulnerability that intimate relationships can give us. On one hand, we have this profound desire to be close, and on the other hand, as soon as you're close with someone, then that possibility of loss is also right there, isn't it? Whether that loss is disillusionment, or death, or karmic unexpecteds, or an inability on your own part to rise to the occasion. As soon as there is intimacy, there is also that fear of loss. So I was, early on in our life together, I did one of those things that women can do. And I will say now that I do it less because I've been through it enough. But women have a way of creating emotional crises out of not very much. Just like sitting there and imagining that he should be different, and if he only were really sensitive, and if he really loved you and was really paying attention, he would be doing something different. I sat and did that to my husband. I sat on the couch. He was actually doing absolutely nothing except living his life, and I gradually became more and more upset, until finally I created a little hoo-ha, which you can create in the household, of what I considered to be his inconsideration. It took hours to sort the whole thing out. And at the end of it, I realized how vulnerable I had come by opening my heart. Just as simple as that. I'd opened my heart, and now once your heart is open, many things can come in. And also many things that are even inherent within you begin to come out. Because in this case, he hadn't done anything to me. I had just created out of my own fear and my own vulnerability, suffering. And there's not one of us that likes to suffer. And so then, all of a sudden, here I am. I've been married for a year. I'm in my early 30s. It's like, the prospects here are not good. What am I going to do? And so I had a real simple solution, which is the solution most of us take. I'll just pull my heart in a little bit and fold my arms over it, and I just won't care so much. That's an easy way to do it, isn't it? And I won't interact with the world around me quite so freely. I mean, you walk down the street, you see people everywhere who've made that exact decision. You know, the posture, the look on the face, the sound of the voice, it's just that decision. It's just too hard to live in this world embracing it fearlessly. And I was no exception. And so I just meditated on this for a long time. What am I going to do? So I decided, I started with where people start. Oh, I think I'll try to create a world in which I am safe. You know, whether that's money or people who are going to behave in a certain way or social position or, you know, what I call the preemptive strike. Anybody who causes me any trouble, I'll go after them first. Whatever it might be. But I thought to myself, in my own marriage, if I start walling myself away right now, like, where is this going to go? 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. So what I decided was that I was married to a good man. You know, he was an honorable person, he was a considerate person, he was going to always do what I wanted him to do. Because that's, of course, what the definition of good is, isn't it? Is that other people conform to my ideas of what I think is right. That's how we come into this world. We have this, when I joke about it sometimes, we have this contract that we've made up. We sort of feel like that we have this deal with God or with the universe, and these conditions are going to be fulfilled. I'm going to marry, I'm going to have children, I'm going to have money, I'm going to have this, I'm going to have comfort, I'm going to have all these different things. And we sort of hold it in our hands, and when the world doesn't respond, we like wave it like this. I suggest to people sometimes if you look really close at the bottom, you'll see your own name with a big flourish, but you realize no one else has signed it. Yeah. No one has signed it. There's no stamp, there's nothing. It's just your concept. So I decided that I would make sure that David conformed to my concept. And of course, it was a good gamble that I married him 30 years later. It's proved to be a very good decision to have made. But I thought to myself, he came out of nowhere in my life, really. He was not part of my plan at that point when he showed up. He just popped out. It's like, you can't always predict what your karmic circumstances will be. Things happen to people. Automobile accidents happen. Other karmas pop up, no matter how sincere and good a person can be. You don't own them. You can't make them do things. Oh, rats, I said, so that one's not going to work. I'm not going to keep myself safe by making a universe around me that behaves the way I want it to behave. So the last thing I thought of was, what do I really think of why I'm here? You know, how do I really feel that this universe is run? And these are not questions that, you know, that I can answer for you. I've spent, as I've said, decades in the company of these masters, physically with Swami Ananda and in spirit with Yogananda and the rest of the lineage, and I've studied and I can speak very, very glibly about how they perceive the universe. And I'm pretty comfortable with that reality now because it really works for me. But sooner or later, one has to just really ask yourself, like, where do I stand? What is life really all about? One of Yogananda's great disciples, a woman named Gyanamata, she had a very simple principle for spiritual life, which is so important. You know, nowadays we're really moving away from dogmas and fixed sets of beliefs, and I am a Methodist and this is what I believe, you know, anything like that. I hope I'm not casting aspersions on anyone, but I was invited to be part of this it was a retreat with a group of clergymen whose denomination I won't name, in America. Two of the clergymen were good friends of mine and were also devotees of Yogananda and on this path. And they invited me to come. They wanted me to teach their colleagues how to meditate. And so I was with this group of all men. There was only one woman. This was about 30 years ago, so that was before women really broke into that career path. And we were there, and since everyone was a preacher, when it came time to pray over lunch, you know, who was going to do it? There was no obvious choice. So there was a lot of good-natured jostling about who was going to say to the prayer, and then Wally or somebody was chosen. And all of a sudden, Wally starts, we've just been talking, just like I'm talking to you. All of a sudden, Wally starts in, "Beloved Lord," like this. I thought he was still joking. And I started to laugh. Oh yeah, bad moment, really, really bad moment. And when I realized that he wasn't joking, he was praying, you know, I coughed and pretended that I was doing something else. But his concept of spiritual life was there's me, and then when God is involved, I have to put on this other costume, literally this clergyman's robe. And the rest of the weekend there, I was, as my friend said to me later, it looked like I was in a foreign country and every word had to be translated. Because my understanding of spiritual life, to which I have completely dedicated myself, it starts way in the deep core of myself. And it's nothing except who I am. And on certain occasions, I always dress in this color. This is an initiation color for me. On certain occasions, I actually have a clergy garb that I put on. So sometimes I do wear a costume. I like wearing costumes because they affirm my reality. But there is no reality from the outside in. It has to be and begin from my own nature. And so trying to explain to those clergymen, most of whom had read their ideas and then put them on, and were always trying to form themselves into the picture. It really was. We were just two civilizations clashing. And as my friend said, all the time I looked like I was translating. Everything that was said to me, it looked like I was just translating, which is exactly what I was doing, trying to figure out, how can I reach these people? Because in the end, we're all the same. Every single living being, from the worm to the president of the country, has two objectives. One is to increase their happiness, and the other is to diminish their suffering. And every single decision that any of us make, we make a decision because we think it will increase our happiness or will diminish our suffering, or both. If you take a little worm who seems not to have a very sophisticated point of view, but if you prick him, he'll try to get away from you. Because he knows what pain is. And he's conscious enough to realize by his own actions he can influence that. Well, coming back to Sister Gyanamata, she says that your spiritual life has to be built on some bedrock understanding that nothing can take away from you, whatever that might be. Dambara was singing for us about, life in the natural world, and in New Zealand, it's like the nature spirits are still very, very busy here. They have a bigger role than they do in other parts of the world, or so it seems to me. The tree devas especially, it seems like you all got the cream of the crop, and they're just really working on those trees. And you go out there, in a lot of the places that we've been already, and you just feel something. There's something more going on than meets the eye. Or maybe it's an internal experience you've had. Maybe it's the way your mother loved you. Maybe it's the moment when your child was born, and all of a sudden you saw that there's a potential that's so much bigger. Maybe it just came to you out of nowhere, or in prayer, or in meditation, or you read Autobiography of a Yogi and you know that this man is telling the truth. That's what happened to Swami Kriyananda. He was a very, very intellectual American man, but he knew he was at the limits of his own understanding. And when he read Autobiography of a Yogi, he realized he had met someone for the first time in his life who knew something so much greater. And he just intuitively, there's no other explanation, he recognized the man, he knew his truth, he crossed the country. I want to be your disciple. I need to know. And Swamiji, for the next 60-some years of his life, he passed away in April of 2013 at the age of 86. That was the bedrock of his spiritual life. Whatever else happened, the bedrock was he was a disciple of a guru, and he knew that that guru was a true guru. And no matter how confusing anything got around that, nothing could ever take that away from him. And it doesn't really matter how small that piece of turf is, but you can never build a spiritual life that will endure the vicissitudes of life unless where you're standing is actually your own. Well, I'm going back. I haven't forgotten. I'm sitting there with my husband trying to figure out what to do. And I wanted to believe in him, which, as I said, it was a considered decision. And after 30 years, I can speak with more authority that my impression of him was correct. In fact, if anything, I underestimated him. I'm very happy to say. Not because I meant to, but because time passes and people expand. But I knew that I myself had changed too much, that I couldn't depend on the world not changing. So I asked myself, what is there that I can absolutely believe in? And already at that time in my life, I had a bedrock reality, which is that if I respond courageously, this goes back to fear, if I'm not afraid, because fear I felt then and I still feel now is just, that's the one that destroys us. If I respond to what God sends me with faith that there is a purpose, and that purpose is to increase my happiness and decrease my suffering in the long run, no matter what the little picture looks like, then everything will be okay. And I looked at my husband in a most human, a woman deeply in love with the man she's married way. But I realized that what I really trusted was not him, but the divine behind him. The greater reality of which we were both a part of that greater reality, and it was the wisdom of that greater reality that had brought us together for purposes that were beyond my ability to understand at times, but not beyond my ability to trust. How do we get to a point like that? The only thing that teaches us is experience. When we ourselves have suffered, when we have been almost crushed or felt crushed by the challenges that have been given us, and yet when we have somehow found within us the ability at least to go on, if not to march triumphantly forward, but at least Yogananda said, for those who persevere to the end, he said, meaning the end of life, and he promised a blessing at the time of transition. Tomorrow afternoon we're talking about death and dying, which is an extremely interesting subject. He said that he would help you through that transition. He said you don't have to march triumphantly to the end. He said you don't even have to be on your hands and knees. He said you can just keep slithering forward on your belly, but just keep going. I've always loved that thought, because sometimes you see we set impossible standards for ourselves and we don't understand. Because part of why life is given to us and the vicissitudes and the dissonances that come in, whether physical, mental, or spiritual, is to awaken us to who and what we actually are. How many times, and I hope that you can answer me in the affirmative, how many times in your life have you realized, and Swamiji Kriyananda put this recently, pain is often the shortest route to happiness, even if we don't like it. It often is. I had this very interesting experience over the course of many years. About 1986, my husband and I and a couple of other friends, we started leading pilgrimages to India. And we took Autobiography of a Yogi, and there were all these places related to that book and related to this line of gurus and the Himalayas and things. And we started taking Americans over to India. The first pilgrimage I led, I'd never been to India. It was really quite comical, actually. I just listened to the local guide, and I knew what was in the book, and I knew spiritual principles, but it was sort of fun. And India has changed so radically in those years. It's a completely different country. And many people, when they were there, they became very upset, primarily by the poverty and the consequences of poverty and overpopulation, which you don't see at all in this country. And in most Western countries, you don't see what you see when you go into what they call emerging nations, developing nations, all those words. And some people, including me, I saw those conditions, and it wasn't that I didn't feel compassion for people. You know, we're all of one stuff. But it didn't agitate me. It was just a fact. And some people were just so completely thrown off by beggars outside the hotel, or living in this beautiful hotel in Calcutta, and then we were there for 5 days, and there's families living on the street below us, and over the course of several days you could watch them come and go and fall asleep and do whatever they had to do in front of us. And some were just totally disconcerted by the presence of this. And I gradually learned over the course of several years of taking people on these journeys. Excuse me, Brian, you might cut this, I have to cough. Okay, you can speak. I once ended a 2-hour meditation with the loudest possible sneeze into a microphone. I really think I set some people back incarnations on that one. And I have this sneeze that can be heard throughout the neighborhood, and I put it through the amplified microphone. So I'm always a little paranoid. Okay. But what I realized when I was there was really simple, which is if the people who had experienced and then accepted that pain is often a necessary stage in our expansion of awareness. We're able to look even at extreme conditions, but there was a kindred understanding, soul to soul, that you're on a journey. And your journey looks very, very different than the journeys that I'm accustomed to seeing, if you've changed cultures and so on. But nonetheless, you look into the eyes, and the soul's on a journey. And your response is not one of, no, you can't be on a journey, it can't be happening. And if that's your response externally, if one is honest, it's almost always the same response inside. No, this can't be happening. And we go and get that contract and we shake it like this at God. This is not how it's supposed to be. But I'm sitting there with my husband thinking, what may come in our life? And I had some friends, just to make it more poignant, beautiful woman and a man. She was in an automobile accident, her brain was injured. And she just became a different person. You know, and he was very noble in his love for her, and he just cared for her and accepted that now he was married to someone else than the woman he had married. I mean, you can't have the contract, but this is what God has given me to do. And if I understand that this whole experience is the ultimate test of how to avoid suffering and how to find happiness, is that happiness going to come to us because everything is in order? Or is it because we're going to discover on deeper and deeper levels of what I am really made? And who am I inside? We've all had to answer that question repeatedly. And all of healing, real healing, it can be incidentally that we manifest new circumstances. And Yogananda has marvelous books, some we have back there, about his power to change reality and his exhortation to us about how we can change reality. I mean, in some of his early lectures, if your arm is severed, you can grow it back. He just declared like that, and, I can do it, you can do it kind of energy. And, naturally I think, oh yeah, sure. I mean, it's not an affirmation I can even take seriously. I'll work on maybe like getting over my cold a day earlier, maybe I can manage that. But his declaration of our potential is truly infinite. We often think of the greater reality that surrounds us. We think about God in a father or a mother form. And that image works for us because we have some experience of that. We have some experience of being children and having to be coaxed and taught and encouraged and challenged and sometimes pushed. You must learn this. My parents were very solid parents with me, and they were always, they were patient, but they also pushed. This is not good enough. You can do better than this. And there's always that tendency of the child, isn't it? That just, I want to play. I don't want to do this. My friend's little boy, she was trying to teach him to use the potty instead of the diaper. And she tried to coax him with, don't you want to be a big boy? Oh, no, Mommy, he said. I love being a baby. Just like that. And of course, so she put off the project for a little while. I reassured her that everyone eventually learns to use the potty. So you don't worry, it'll come. And of course, in time it did. But it's so representative of how we feel, isn't it, sometimes? That we want to have our suffering stop by having ourselves just be able to go back to the way it was. We're always wanting to go back to the way it was. And instead, what our Divine Mother and our Heavenly Father are saying to us is that you have infinite, unlimited possibilities. And as Yogananda put it once, the difficulties of life are not given to crush us, but to awaken within us the infinite potential of our own strength. Now, when I'm there with my husband trying to understand how to define the rest of my life, what I'm looking for is I'm looking for something that I can depend on. Now, in the end, all of us were born into this world as a unique individual, and the whole time we live in this world, we live as a unique individual. One of the things that drew me onto the spiritual path very powerfully, I was about 18 years old, and it occurred to me that I would die. And I didn't know as much about death as I know now. I wasn't afraid so much as, the only thing I can say is slightly bewildered about that fact. And I was also aware, I believe in reincarnation, so I know all of this was a carried over thought. I was aware that no matter, when you're 18, you're looking out at this whole possibility. No matter where I was going to end up, no matter who I was going to be with, no matter how many, kinsmen and friends and Nobel laureates or whatever it was that I had around me, there would be a moment when I would breathe my last. And all I would have would be my own consciousness at that moment. No one could be in there with me. And I became very, very concerned as to what would be in there when everything else was gone. And at that point, 18, I mentioned I went to college. I lasted 1 year and barely that. Because by that point, I wanted to know what would be in my consciousness at my last breath, and nobody at the university cared. And I think nobody knew. And it wasn't until I met Swami Kriyananda that somebody was talking to me about how to make myself truly well. And once we sort of pick it up by that string, it's not as if we can't then go forward. In fact, you see, it's just the opposite. Once I made the decision that what I trusted was not that David would always behave in a certain way, but that whatever life sent me, God would give me the strength to go through it. And when I speak of that, I don't mean some God like, now we are praying kind of God. I use the word God, but what I mean is that part of myself that connects to infinity. And that's real healing. And when the more connected we are to that greater reality, you see, all the time we're resisting. Reality is moving us through all these experiences to show us, where our happiness really comes from and where our suffering really comes from. Just 2 questions. When Yogananda came out of India and came to America, he brought with him one little book, which he didn't even write himself. He just outlined the ideas and someone who was better at English wrote out for him. It was called The Science of Religion. And he reduced the entire orthodox tradition of thousands of years of Himalayan masters to these 2 principles: the desire to escape suffering, the desire to find happiness. And what we have to do when we start thinking about healing ourselves and others, so we have to ask ourselves, where does happiness really come from? And to heal is to always be in touch with that. I had a dear friend, she's passed away now, and this is the story of this beautiful woman, physically beautiful woman, extremely glamorous, lovely woman. And she married a handsome, wonderful man, and he made lots of money. And they had this gorgeous home, which she decorated to the nines. She had 2 perfect children. It was just like everything. Then, of course, she's 55 and she gets cancer. There you are. She managed to outlive everybody's predictions for quite a long time. She got her youngest child out of high school and almost all the way through college. That was sort of what she wanted. But she was very ill, and she was ill from the start. And finally, the doctor finally told her that there was nothing more they could do, and that, it was a matter of probably at that point months. She didn't live in our community, but just by pure intuition, I just went over to see her that very morning. She lived some distance from me, but I woke up and I thought, this is where I should be. And I just drove over and walked into her house right after this had happened. And she's so sweet. She'd been sick then for a number of years and been through a lot. And first of all, just like a little child, she looks at me and she says, I know it sounds funny, but I really thought I was going to get well. She says, just like that, all evidence to the contrary. I really thought I was going to get well. This wasn't a divine revelation. This was just her contract said she was going to get well. And then she kind of gestured to this beautiful room we're sitting in, which encompassed everything. She said, how can I leave all of this? How can I leave this? By this time, I'm crying too. You can't, but life is so intense. We're both crying. But I have a bedrock spot. We are part of a greater reality. This life is a journey. At the end of it, we come in alone, and at the end, we leave alone. And all of these wonderful people that we experience, they move with us. We're not meeting them for the first time. Why is it that, my husband walked into my world, and oh dear, there he is. It was sort of like, this wasn't my plan, but there he is. And after that, it was just a matter of time before the plan expressed itself. This woman I'm talking to, she and her husband met, at college, just like this. Right away. She says, how can I leave all this? I said to her, there's a wall of fire you have to walk through, and a million tears. Because it would, you don't give philosophy to someone at a point like that. You don't say, oh, be detached. I said, there's a wall of fire and a million tears, but you'll find that there's light on the other side of it. And she heard me, and she had a lot of faith. And time passed, and I'm there the last hours of her life with just the tiny bit of energy she has left. She looks up at me and she says, you were right. Just like that, you were right. And then just with this beautiful smile. She says goodbye to everyone in her life. You know, all these beautiful people are all there. She says goodbye to all of them. And then just goes away. Now that's healing. She died, but that's healing. You know, and sometimes we don't die. Sometimes, in fact, amazing, phenomenal shifts take place. But in the end, it all comes back to who am I inside? What do I believe? Do I have trust? As I often put it, if it isn't the happy ending, it's not the ending. Even if it looks sad in the moment and you don't know where it's going, it can't be the ending. Because it all resolves when we have that. And that's what we give each other. You know, I used to take over people's lives. I have a lot of willpower and a lot of energy. And I thought that what God wanted me to do was to take over people's lives. You're sick, I'll nurse you. You need food, I'll cook for you. You need to be organized, I'll fix your life. You need to be taken to the doctor, I'll drive you. You know, you need new clothes, I'll find them for you. And I would take over people's lives and just run their lives. And, you know, I was phenomenally good at it. As I often say, I'm very good with other people's crises, extremely good. But one day this odd thing I realized is that, there's that old word fear again. It began to happen when it really came crystal clear when my parents went into the last years of their life. I realized that I was afraid of their suffering. And I felt I had to stop their suffering. And here's the odd twist that I got into that. I wasn't afraid of my own karma. I mean, I've been tested. I could certainly be tested past my graceful acceptance. I have no doubt about that. And God, if you're listening, it's fine, go ahead. But I don't hang around being afraid of my karma. I figure if it's my karma, it's the metaphysical law. If the karma comes, it's because you're ready to handle it. God doesn't give you more than you can handle, and there's very esoteric reasons why that's true. Karma doesn't rise until energy pulls it forward. I'm not afraid of my karma, but I vaguely thought I was the only person in the world who could face their own karma. Everybody else needed me to help them do it. And how deeply insulting that was suddenly occurred to me. And I wondered why people were not always so grateful. And I realized it was because of the insult implied, the lack of respect for their ability to take care of themselves. And of course, I just found another way to help. But anything that has fear at the base of it is never going to be the happy ending, because there's always going to be a little twist in it. And when I began instead to trust that wherever this is going is where it needs to go. And I will certainly stand there and help you. And I developed another prayer. This is the prayer I've used ever since. Divine Mother, if you're going to send this people this kind of problem and I have to witness it, then you better help them get through it. When my parents were declining, I would pray, Divine Mother, give them the wisdom, the humility, the devotion to learn whatever it is you're trying to teach them. And I would really appreciate it if you would speed it along, because it's not always easy. My mother had Parkinson's, which is really a tough one, 15 years of it. But after about 12, we went out to lunch one day, and my mother in her way says, I hate to admit it, she says, but this disease has been the making of me. And I had to say, you're right, Mom. She was a bit of a weakling and rather spoiled. Fine woman, but she was a bit of a weakling and rather spoiled. And then God sent her this, hellacious challenge. And she fought like a tiger, just to keep going and to keep her spirits up. And she was terribly attached to my dad and stay with my dad and help him, and just so powerful. And she discovered something. And I know when she goes to the astral world and then reincarnates again, far better person. Would I have taken that away from her if I could have? Why are we here? What is our bedrock of understanding? What is true healing? The more we can trust. I've been present, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow in the afternoon, at a number of deaths, including my father. I missed my mother. I was out of the country, but I was with my dad. And wow, just to have somebody in the room who's not afraid. Even when somebody's going through something really terrible, or has a mental breakdown, or just to have somebody in the room who's not afraid. And where does that courage come from? It comes from our bedrock of understanding. We are all part of a greater reality. Pain is often the fastest route to freedom. And if it's not the happy ending, the story's not over yet. So what do I have to fear? It's an exciting movie, If you have any questions, if anyone has any questions, yes.
You said about is moving from the real world to the spiritual world. Is Shanti a term that you're familiar with? What does that mean?
The word Shanti means peace, and people say Om Shanti. Shanti also is, in English, we use the word God, and it means whatever you want to make it mean. It doesn't have any inherent meaning. Many people declare themselves atheists because whatever concepts of God were offered to them, they didn't like, and many times I agree with them, even though I use the word God quite freely. In the Sanskrit language, there are many words that can be exactly translated as the word God, but actually have meaning that we can grasp more collectively. And Shanti is one of those words. Shanti means peace, but it's not just the peace that all 5 of the children are finally in bed or something like that. It's what Jesus called the peace that passeth understanding. It's when all disharmony has ceased, and that means throughout our whole being. So when people are chanting Om, they're trying to attune themselves to that more subtle vibration, and then trying to think of that vibration as manifesting as peace. The divine, the infinite spirit manifests in 8 classic forms, and Shanti is one of them. Ananda, which is the name of our community, means joy. And it is also, you could say, Ananda means God, but what it actually means is unconditioned bliss, which is a very different thing. Who doesn't want or believe or hope for unconditioned bliss? Prem, infinite love, same words. So it's kind of a tradition. People say Om Shanti. It's become a rote phrase that people use. Sometimes I'll tell you a funny story. Shanti is also a woman's name. And in our community, there's a woman, and she named her first daughter Shanti, and her second daughter she named Isabel. And it was the custom, whenever they said grace over meals, it would always end Om Shanti Shanti. But when Isabel got old enough, they had to change the prayer for a while to Om Shanti Isabel, which they did until Isabel learned. All right, any other questions? Or yes?
Interested in suicide. A lot of people, would feel that suicide is, well, there's lots of consequences. And you mentioned a happy ending. There's not a happy ending, then it's not the end.
It's not the end.
And
Where does suicide fit? Okay. Reincarnation is essential, or else the world makes no sense at all. This is my opinion. If it's only between birth and death, it's a pretty grim story. Okay. If there is such a thing as reincarnation, and if in fact we are divine in our reality, if we are manifestations of a greater reality, we are all part of that, there is no possible way you can kill that. So all that a suicide does is they kill their physical body. They can't eradicate their consciousness, and they can't cause themselves to cease to exist. So this again, we keep coming here. This is what I'm talking about tomorrow afternoon. There's the material world we're in now. There's the energy world, which is called the astral world. There's a more subtle world, which is called the causal world. And the movies are all about the astral world now, where the beam of light comes and everybody goes off, and all the stories of the near-death and return experiences, and they go into this other realm. All of that's very, very true. What's happening, the biggest problem with suicide is that it doesn't accomplish anything. Because a person has been brought to a certain point of suffering by whatever bad decisions and unfortunate things have happened. And they have decided that rather than believe and find the faith to go through it, which is what I've been talking about, they will try to escape it. And so they will try to escape it with the false idea that if I kill this body, that somehow I will kill the pain. But the pain is within their own consciousness, because that's the thing about suicide that is so, just profoundly distressing for everyone that's left, is that the pain was just in their own mind. They had everything to live for, or maybe not, but nonetheless, it was just in their own mind. It was in their consciousness. It wasn't even in their brain, you see. You kill the brain is an expression of consciousness. The consciousness remains. Just like in the movies, the spirit goes. But it goes into that state. There's a very interesting book written by a woman who, unfortunately, I can't remember it, the name of it. She tried to kill herself, but didn't succeed. But she went to where people who commit suicide go, and this basically, they're like this. And they're there for a long time. She went there, and she was there, and she was in this darkness. She realized she'd made a terrible mistake. It's fascinating what she said. She wasn't a church-going person or even a woman of faith, but the word Jesus came to her mind. And as soon as the word Jesus came to her mind, she lifted her eyes. And this is her story of the astral world. She lifted her eyes, and right above this place of dark suffering, there were all these angels, all these beings of light, and they were trying to get the attention. And this is exactly like what it is in this world. When a person is determined to suffer, you can just go around and around and around and try to help them. If they won't lift their eyes, you can't help them. So she lifted her eyes, and one of these beings pulled her out. She came back to her body. So the karma for suicide is that, first of all, it doesn't work. And then you get to stay in the astral world unhappy for a long time until something moves. This woman said she had the impression that a lot of those people had been there for a long time. But compared to eternity, all time is short. So even if it's a while, they're there. But unfortunately, what happens is you have to be brought, this is how it's said to me, and this is the only thing that makes sense according to the law of karma, is that you have to be brought all the way to that same point and have the courage to face it. So you just back up, and then you just get to be brought to it again and again. And this is what eventually gets you through. And I mean, I'm not at all suicidal, but the principle that I either face it now or I face it later is a very strong motivator. Miserable as the karma may be that I'm facing, I don't want to see it again. And so there just comes a point where the imagined suffering of having to change is less than continuing in the suffering you have right now. And if people you love have suicided and are gone, you can still reach them. Their spirits are still equally active, and above all, what you have to send to them is light, hope, and courage. If you're grief-stricken and frantic and upset, you're just heaping that vibration on top of them. And of course, it's very easy to feel that way because you've watched this misery and now you know they're going to have to do it again. But there's no other answer. You know, spiritual life is very challenging. It's easier to blame and to fear, to really overcome that fear. It takes a lot. It's for heroes. But what choice do we have? Sooner or later, not everyone, but many people, everyone, yes, everyone eventually. But sooner or later, it's worth it. You remember. This is where past lives come in. You remember. And you remember that nothing else worked, so now I'm just going to face it. Interestingly. I'm glad you asked that question, but that's a hard one. Say again? I believe you, and in as much as I'm here sharing what I know, I'll offer it, and if you prefer what he has to say, then ask him afterwards. No, I'm not going to invite you to say it now. But no, whatever. Yeah, whatever is fine. Yeah, whatever is fine. No, I respect that if that's how you feel. All right, yes, Wendy. Yes. It's terrible at the end of the talk when they ask you what the talk was about. Oh dear. Find your bedrock of spiritual faith. Cultivate it. Become as strong in it as you can. Overcome as much as possible your fear of your own and other people's suffering. And stand in that courage. Everything else follows from that. You know? So I guess in a sense I feel I did answer it. There's many, many, many more things that could be said in an hour. That was what occurred to me to say. Is that fair enough? There's a very, very good book from Ananda village called Divine Will Healing. I don't have a copy of it, but if you go onto the ananda.org website and type in Divine Will Healing, it's a collection of many more specific methods. I tend to go to the essence of things and then let you find it after that. No, I understand. I'm only... Excuse me, I was laughing. I wasn't feeling criticized. I was feeling amused. I sail out, and I never know where I'm going either. So, I understand. All right. Anything else? All right. Thank you all very much for coming. Tomorrow morning, we're doing intuition and guidance, which is very closely related to this subject, because how to know what to do and when to do it. In the afternoon, we're doing death, dying, grief, and the astral world. I read from this little book, How to Achieve Glowing Health and Vitality, which is Yogananda's book. And we have quite a few books back there for sale if you're interested. And also, here's a CD, Dambar's personal CD. If you like listening to his voice, you can listen to it more and more. There's a great many things back there, and if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them, or any of our other crowd here would be happy to talk with you. So, thank you all very much for coming. I hope to see at least some of you tomorrow. God bless you. It's very nice to be in this space. This is a beautiful room.